Goleta's Prisoner of War Camp. If you're driving on the 101 just south of El Capitan, look towards the ocean and you may see this old wooden structure. Believe it or not, it is the remains of a water tower from a prisoner of war camp. Most folks have no idea, but Goleta had Nazi soldiers living and working right here in our backyard. During World War II, there were 600 POW camps in the United States for captured German and Italian soldiers. The War Department decided to detain them in the U.S. to relieve the fighting forces in Europe and provide labor for the American farmers. In 1944, the existing Camp Cooke near Lompoc, now Vandenberg, was designated as a camp for German prisoners of war. Construction of a separate fenced area was built in the corner of the camp. A few months later, POWs started arriving. Under Camp Cooke, 16 smaller branch camps were established that put prisoners closer to where they were needed to work. Camp Cooke also housed Italian POWs that were reportedly brought into town for meals at Mom's Italian Village. The Goleta location was built on Edwards Ranch near Naples. An existing worker camp was modified to be secure enough to hold prisoners. The Edwards camp operated for 14 months from October 1944 until December 1945, and it housed about 250 prisoners. This shot is from 1944, before it had been modified for the POW camp. Most of the POWs were professional men from General Rommel's elite Africa Corps. Some were hardcore believers in Hitler's master race theories, and they had no doubt Germany would win the war. They had endured very difficult conditions in the deserts of northern Africa, and most were starving, filthy, and desperate. Many were captured by French, New Zealand, or Algerian soldiers, and they were abused, starved, and used as slave labor by their captors. They were relieved to be turned over to the American troops because they followed the rules of the Geneva Convention, which ensured that they would at least be kept warm, clean, and fed. As you can tell by the smiles, most of these war-weary young men felt like they hit the jackpot when they got showered, deloused, clothed, and fed all they could eat. Most of them had been starving for years due to the limited supplies available to the German soldiers. In Germany, the troops traveled on freight trains like livestock. But in the US, they were loaded onto comfortable passenger trains and they watched through glass windows as the wide open spaces of America passed before their amazed eyes. They were stunned by the size and the wealth of the United States. After spending time in temporary camps in Arizona and Idaho, they were taken to the brand new facility at Camp Cooke and then trucked to the branch camp at Edwards near Goleta. The majority of the prisoners were happy in their new camp and they were happy to work on the nearby ranches. Newspaper coverage of the camps and public knowledge were intentionally limited until the end of the war, in part to comply with the Geneva Convention, and in part to avoid the fear of an enemy presence in such large numbers. While most citizens living near camps accepted the prisoners' presence, the government received hundreds of letters each week protesting their good treatment. Many demanded that the POWs be immediately killed, an understandable sentiment given the regular casualty lists in American newspapers. This aerial photo shows the camp when it was in use. Prisoners were fed generously, were offered religious service and classes in English and other topics, and they received excellent medical care if needed. They enjoyed a sports field for soccer, a phonograph, a radio, a library, a small theater, ping pong tables, and they were allowed to swim in the nearby ocean on a regular basis. Occasionally, the guards would even join them. It was enclosed by an 8-foot wire fence topped with barbed wire, and it had guard towers with machine gun mounts. Technically, they were prisoners of war, but many developed friendships with their captors and were treated with respect. The campgrounds were landscaped by the prisoners with flower boxes, bushes, and a vegetable and fruit garden. A Red Cross inspector reported, "The camp looks like a garden. We have never seen a camp decorated with as much taste and love of nature." The prisoners had a variety of pastimes available to them. They painted, did wood sculpture, had a theater group, and even formed an orchestra. Many of them said later they didn't feel like POWs at the Edwards camp. But they did have to work. Since most able-bodied men were gone to fight the war, California had a shortage of workers on the ranches and elsewhere. Locally, they were put to work harvesting lemons, cotton, walnuts, and other crops. They also processed walnuts at a packing house on Kellogg Avenue in Goleta. Most of the prisoners enjoyed the hard work, and sometimes the farmers would provide them with a homemade lunch. The prisoners were given instructional booklets in German to help explain the details of agricultural work. Gil Garcia, whose father often supervised German crews on the local ranches, remembers once going with him and a German crew to pick walnuts. His father had to explain to one POW several times how to use a tool to knock the walnuts off the branch. The Nazi soldier took the tool back and uttered something in German in an angry tone. The guard told Garcia, he said, "I never thought a brown man would be telling me what to do." Later, at lunchtime, his father was warming his burritos on the embers of a fire, and he offered one to the soldier that had made the nasty comment. He liked it so much he became very friendly to Mr. Garcia. Word soon got around the German crew about the delicious burritos, and he would have to bring extras to pass around. That taught the younger Garcia a life lesson he would never forget. Elizabeth Arrow Vobel remembers her father hiring some prisoners to help in his lima bean fields at Refugio. They came with a couple of guards. A while later, her father came in the house and sat down, obviously shaken. He told them one of his regular ranch hands, whose son had been killed in the war, came home to find the Germans working in the fields. He had been drinking in town and was enraged to see Nazis so close to home. He went to a small house by the barn and came back with a rifle. Walking up to the POWs, he said, "You killed my son, and I'm going to kill you." After some calm talk and reasoning, Vobel's father took the rifle away from the man and he walked him back to his house. The Germans were paid for their work with coupons that they could spend as they wished in the camp store that sold a variety of items. Many of the former POWs reported being treated very fairly at the camp, enjoying 3 square meals and the mild climate. One soldier was quoted as saying the best day of his life was when he was taken prisoner. Things could definitely have been worse. Many of their comrades ended up as frozen corpses on the Russian front. The POW camps were closed in June 1946, and the prisoners were turned over to the European armies who put them to work in their countries until their troops could return from war duties. Some prisoners did not return to their countries until the early 1950s. Years later, some still reminisced about the warm summer sunsets overlooking the Pacific Ocean. Many of the POWs fell in love with California and returned after the war to spend the rest of their lives here. After the war, the camp was used as housing for ranch workers. Don James remembers living in one as a small boy. They lived in a small hut right below the water tower. Accommodations were modest. There were 3 rooms in the 50-foot-long hut, a living room, a kitchen, and a bathroom. No bedrooms, so they slept on the couch or the floor. The camp was still surrounded by barbed wire, and he remembers playing with other kids in the guard towers. He would take the bus to Elwood School. These are sketches by Don James of how it looked when he lived in the camp. Don James and his family lived there until 1954. The Quonset huts were used by laborers until the huts were burned down in 1970. In the United States, at the end of World War II, there were over 425,000 prisoners of war. The camps were located all over the U.S. The internet has some interesting info about escapes and riots in some POW camps. The Goleta camp never experienced this. Some cities have commemorated the former POW campsites with historic markers. But the site of Goleta's POW camp is still little known and rarely acknowledged by our local officials. Most of the camp was destroyed, leaving only the water tower. Given that it is an important part of our history and the treatment of the prisoners was nothing to be ashamed of, maybe one day Goleta will officially acknowledge the presence of this historic site before the old water tower is gone and forgotten.